to day 4 of the AGU fall meeting. I hope you've had a chance to network with new friends and colleagues, participate in workshops and town halls, and watch e-lightning presentations, and visit our exhibitors' booths. Who knew this would be possible in our virtual world? As you know already, but I'll remind you, next week is the core week of the AGU fall meeting. That's when the scientific sessions and posters will begin. And we have a lot of fun and surprises in store for you next week. I know that this virtual fall meeting is a new experience for us all. But I think we can agree that it's an enjoyable one. I really do miss those serendipitous run-ins when I get to see old friends in the halls and meet new people when we're all dashing from session to session. A virtual meeting is really making us be much more intentional and careful with our focus. And I think as it challenges us to think outside of the box, which is exactly what we need to do when it comes to some of the really critical issues our global community is facing today. When we think about the theme of the fall meeting, shaping the future of science, and what it means to each of us individually and to us collectively, when we think about creating an earth and space sciences that is opening and welcome to all, we want the best ideas and the most creative brains at the table. We want people who ask questions and challenge our assumptions. We want people who focus both on discovery and solutions because they're intertwined, and we need both to move forward to solve the world's problems. Unfortunately, that's not what always happened. That's why we at AGU have been focusing on creating a more diverse, more inclusive community, from supporting Indigenous scientists and working with Indigenous communities to address diversity and racism in the geosciences and in academia. AGU has taken a number of leadership positions to improve the geoscience community so it's more inclusive and more diverse. I know I've certainly seen a lot of change, both from the meeting rooms to who's walking across the stage to receive honors since I began, but there's so much more work to be done. Today's plenary speaker is one of the community's leading figures who is pushing us all to be better and to implement changes both at his university and beyond. Freeman has had such an accomplished career. He's published numerous journals on science and math education, a book on what a university should look like. He's chaired the National Academy's committee that published the report, Expanding Underrepresented Minority Participation, America's Science and Technology Talent at the Crossroads. He chaired President Obama's Advisory Commission on Excellent Education for African Americans. And he's also had an immensely successful TED Talk about the 4 pillars of college success in science, something we can all learn from. He's also served as president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County since 1992. Due to his leadership, UMBC has been consistently ranked as one of the best colleges in the US on many metrics, including being the #1 producer in the United States for African American undergraduates who complete a PhD or an MD, and the #2 college for African American undergraduates who complete a science or engineering PhD. Please join me in welcoming Freeman Hrabowski.
Hello, I'm Freeman Hrabowski, president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC. I'm delighted to be giving this address to AGU, a group I have a great deal of respect for. I want to thank both Peter Goodwin and Eric Davidson, my colleagues from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, for encouraging me to look at the invitation, and other colleagues who did the same thing. And I was very lucky to have the chance to talk with 2 of my colleagues at the UMBC campus, both Anthony Johnson and Belay Demos, about these issues that I will be discussing today, the idea of reversing structural racism. Both Belai and Anthony are African American, two of the small number of African American physicists in the country. I begin with words of poetry. It was William Carlos Williams who said, "It's difficult to find news in poetry, and yet men, I would say, and women die miserably because of a lack of what's found there." And so I begin actually with the words of the late Maya Angelou, who said to America at the installation of a former president these words: "Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it, this dream, into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the image of your most public self. Sculpt it into the shape of your most private need. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning." My message today is that the way we think about ourselves as humankind, as a society, as scientists, the language that we use, the way we interact with each other, the values that we hold will be so important. We become like that which we love. I am coming from a campus that has 3 centers that are related to the work that we're discussing today: our Joint Center for Earth Systems Technology, the Center for Space Sciences and Technology, and Goddard Planetary Heliophysics Institute. And Belai Demos has worked with Anthony in doing several things. One, in recruiting more students of color, African Americans, Latinx, using the National Society of Black Physicists and the National Society of Hispanic Physicists, to bring in undergraduates and to focus on internships and giving them more information about the geosciences. They've also partnered with other minority-serving institutions such as the City University of New York and Howard University and HBCU for the purpose of broadening the understanding of the possibilities of having a career broadly in the geosciences. I am on a campus that is a mid-sized research public university. We're actually number 13 in funding from NASA and ranked number 27 in funding for geosciences, atmospheric sciences, and ocean sciences. And we're also the number 1 producer of Black undergraduates who go on to complete MD PhDs, and number 2 in production of the natural sciences and engineering PhDs in general. And so I bring with me the experiences of our campus and the work we've done with other campuses in this area. I should say something that we all know, and that is that it is a critical time in our society, a time when we are evolving, not only as an American society, but around the world. And that somehow the COVID pandemic, the issues of structural racism, again, around the world, the growing lack of trust in science are things that we see, are themes that we are grappling with in humankind at this point. My campus has students from 100 countries, and 60% of our students, while being American, have at least one parent who is from another country. And so when we talk about students walking around, it feels like the Plaza of Nations at the UN. But it also gives us a chance to think about how people from different cultures, different religions, different parts of the world view what we are doing in this country and what's going on in other countries. And that's why I continue to say this issue of structural racism is not simply an American issue. It is a broad issue. In fact, I was very impressed by the publication of from your leadership, from Robin Bell and the President-elect Susan Lozier, a piece that focused on reversing structural racism recently, especially when you think about all the press you've gotten from the New York Times and others about the geosciences being the least diverse of all the sciences. It took courage for your group, for these leaders to speak out and say, we are better than this. And they talked about a number of themes, from promoting an inclusive scientific culture, to sustained funding, to partnering with others on this work. And that brings me to the book that my colleagues and I, Peter Henderson and Philip Rouse, a physicist, and I wrote recently that came out a few months ago, entitled The Empowered University. And the subtitle is Shared Governance, Culture Change, Academic Success. And the most important point is the book, is that we as a society, not just as a university, but that we must be empowered as scientists to look in the mirror at self and to appreciate what we have achieved for the common good, for the public, but also to understand how we can be better. And this is what both Robin and Susan were talking about, and I will refer to some of the things they said and what I would be recommending. Eric Weiner, in his book, The Geography of Bliss, suggests that culture is the sea we swim in, so all-consuming that we fail to recognize it until we step out of it and look back at ourselves. This is a time to be empowered and to look at self, whether stepping out of the sea or looking in the mirror. And the fact is that we need to take the brain power we're using in studying science and solving problems to solve this problem of structural racism in our societies around the world. And there's several aspects that I think are most critical. Everyone would agree that we have to find ways of broadening participation in the geosciences for a lot of reasons. This is a time when we're seeing how one of the challenges I mentioned before, the pandemic, connects to the others: structural racism, the lack of trust in science, and we see the disproportionately large numbers of people of color dying. We see that in the African American community, Latinx, and others. And the fact is, we see people without strong education, without solid academic preparation, not believing in science and congregating in large numbers and not taking the advice of scientists and medicine. And the question becomes, what can we do about it? There's several things I would say. Number one, if we want to have the support for the work we do, as we think about furthering science, as we think about attacking the challenges involving climate change, as we think about all of the wonderful, wonderful attributes of the environment, but the challenges we face as human behavior has a way of degrading and taking away from what has been given to us as the world, as the earth. The fact is that we will need to pull many more people into this work so that we can show people of different backgrounds that they are represented in the work. And that means many things. And we see the same thing in public health. We see the same thing in science. And I'll talk about that in a little while. But let me suggest to you several things that are important. Number one, it's very important that we think about that faculty diversity. And I know you realize that when your leaders talked about funding and incentives that will lead to diversity and equity, successful diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives, nothing could be more important than broadening the professoriate, broadening participation in the professoriate. And what will that mean? For more people of color, for more women, and because when we look at it, it's a matter of being able to be more effective in recruiting, in hiring, and supporting, and promoting, and retaining faculty of color and women. And when we look at those populations and what's happening right now, the few that we have, we even see that the studies show disproportionately large numbers leaving those areas. What would I say is the issue? It's something I said before: the culture of universities, the culture of departments. At the heart of the matter will be the power of the professoriate. And I would say several things. Number one, we have learned a great deal from the National Science Foundation's advanced program. I was privileged to serve as PI on our advanced program and to see the percentage of women in our STEM fields going from 12% to about a third. Not where we need to be, but substantial increases, with co-PIs who are women chairs who've gone on now in some cases to become deans, in other cases other leadership roles. But the lessons that we learned from working with our students, our minority students, were very helpful as we looked at what we could do to look at gender issues, women, including women of color in STEM. And I would suggest, and I've said this in several articles, from a recent PNAS article to an article in The Atlantic, that we can learn a great deal from the work of the gender work at the National Science Foundation about what we can do for students and for faculty in those areas. In the geosciences, the communications issue, as you know, how do we help more people understand just how important these disciplines are to their lives and to the lives of future generations? I often use a story from a former head of the National Academy of Engineering who would ask audiences why people thought it was the case that our lifespan had doubled, literally doubled in 100 years. That we're talking about people living to be about 80 now, and in 1900 it was mid 40s, early to mid 40s, and people give many reasons. But the number one reason that the National Academy of Engineering gives is the sewage system and clean water. All of you can appreciate that. But people don't think about an engineer being involved in saving their lives. And the point to us today is that we must help people from all backgrounds understand that, contrary to what some in a misinformed way would say about climate change, that we understand these issues are real and that it will take all of us to change the trajectory to save the planet and to save our generations to come. And that means people who are literate about these matters in science and believing in evidence, and those who become the experts, so that the general population can say, we're all represented there. That it's not about an elite group of heavily white men, but rather people from all backgrounds reflecting humankind, not just in this country, but around the world. And so what must we do? I mentioned the need to diversify the faculty, and we do need to make sure we're supporting the small numbers of those who have earned PhDs and postdocs, as we think about ways of furthering their careers, as we think about, as your leaders talked about, making sure they are represented on committees and listening to their perspectives and giving them opportunities to grow and develop, and partnering with them in the writing of grants, and making sure we clearly understand how their careers are going. And so one of the points I'm making is about the need to be proactive and mindful, not just to accept the fact that there are a few here and there. Who are the people right now who are in the pipeline in this field, from grad school to the faculty? Who are the young faculty members? Because there would have to be very few senior people, such as the two I mentioned earlier, Belay and Anthony. Most are coming along. Who's giving them support? How do we understand the distinction between being a mentor and being a champion? We need mentors, people to whom people can go and get advice. But the champion is somebody who will knock down a door to give support. The champion can be intrusive and give tough love if necessary. But the champion will be saying to the larger community, we must look at this person as a treasure and give this person the support, because this person will help us dramatically to change our discipline. And so, beyond the faculty, the big issue is, but where are these people going to come from? Because even after doing all of that for the existing group, we know that group is so small that we must increase the number of graduate students in these areas. And the ineluctable question becomes, then how do you do that? Well, it's through looking at the undergraduate experience. When people talk about shortages in the number of people in our country in certain disciplines, most will immediately go to the K through 12 issue. And while that is a challenge, that is not our most critical issue at this point, as we think about any low-hanging fruit. I was privileged to chair the National Academy's Committee on underrepresentation in science broadly for racial groups, racial and ethnic groups, 10 years ago. And we found that we were actually stunned by the number of people who actually began in science and engineering who left it within the first year or two. It didn't surprise us that only 20% of Blacks and Latinx students who begin with a major in STEM will graduate with a major, with a bachelor's degree in STEM. But we were stunned to find out that only about a third of whites and only 41% of Asians who begin with these disciplines will actually graduate in these disciplines. And the percentage for Native Americans is well below that of the Blacks and Latinx. And what does that say? Well, the first response, of course, was that it's a K through 12 problem if they're not making it past the freshman or sophomore year in these disciplines. And that's what we tend to do. Grad schools will blame undergrad schools blame the high schools blame the elementary schools, and the schools in general blame the parents, and the husband blames the wife. We all point fingers at other people. We decided to do something different, and we had faculty, professors from Harvard and MIT to Howard to Miami-Dade Community College to the UTexas system. And what we determined was that even though we need to improve K through 12 education, no doubt about that, and there are many students who don't have the preparation they need, that large numbers of well-prepared students come to our universities and don't succeed. In fact, it is the case that often the more socially prestigious the university, the greater the chance that student will leave science in the first year or two. Why? They'll get a C in a course or below. And yet they earn A's in the humanities and social sciences. They're moving to a more nurturing area. And if they were thinking about becoming a doctor, they become a lawyer often. Or if they were thinking about engineering, they go into some other discipline where they can earn the A's and feel that they are quite talented. And yet these are students often who have very high test scores, AP scores, SATs, ACTs. And so we actually weed out large percentages of students across the races. 2/3 of those. In fact, only about 5% are graduating with degrees in natural sciences and engineering, compared to about 11% in Europe. And if it were not for the very talented students we get from around the world who come to this country, we would have a major challenge as we look at the enrollments in our graduate schools. And we want people from around the world. The point is, we also, though, want students from this country to be able to succeed, and particularly when looking at these groups that are completely underrepresented in these areas. And what will make the difference? Well, what we recommended was redesigning courses at the undergrad level, particularly the first year or two, and an emphasis on several fundamental principles. Those are principles that you will find if you look at any of my articles in our Meyerhoff Scholars Program. You heard me say we lead the country for students who are African American who go on to get MD PhDs, and number two in the development of PhDs. But what's the model that works? That's now being replicated at places like Penn State and Chapel Hill with money from Howard Hughes, funding a great deal of support with replication, or from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation as they look at doing things for underrepresented groups at Berkeley and San Diego. What is that model? The model fits with my TED Talk, which involves first 4 principles, I say, of success in science. It is the high expectations. It is building community. It is that it takes scientists to produce scientists, and it's rigorous evaluation to decide what needs to be changed. And the high expectations, most important, means not just of our students, but of ourselves. How often do we have students of color in our classes? What are we doing to pull in more students from different groups to understand they can come out of, whether it's out of the life sciences, out of computational areas, out of physics, and have careers in the geosciences? How do we go about having a community of students who can be with a vision of getting involved in geosciences? One of the most important themes, academic themes on our campus for research and teaching, really is the environment. In many ways, so our students from environmental engineering to environmental science, to those who are in areas such as physics particularly, but some other areas, and those who are in marine biology, all the way over to environmental policy. So people have these interests. They need to know the opportunities. And while we have done some things on our campus, because of the work of those professors I mentioned before, I know there's much more we can do. And I want you to think about the term, the expression success is never final. We can do much more in the geosciences. And this has given me a chance in preparing for this talk to think about the other things that we can do. And so I want you to think about the notion that whether it's the undergrad level or the grad level, this idea of building a community of students. It's very hard when it's one or two people, one or two women, one or two blacks. My background is math. When I was in that graduate program at the University of Illinois and could not see any people looking like me on the professoriate. There was only one woman faculty member there at Urbana-Champaign at that time, and she was wonderful. She was PhD, but not tenure track, but excellent, and she taught undergrad and grad courses, and she had a way of giving me a look to say, I understand what you're going through, and it made a difference. If you've not been the only one in the room, if you've not had that experience, it's hard for you to know what people go through, whether they're tough-skinned or not. And so having a chance to hear the voices of the few people who are succeeding can be very helpful. But I would suggest you look at the science paper that my colleagues and I wrote on Meyerhoff replication, and as well as recent piece done in the Atlantic on what higher education broadly can do to reverse racism, the role we must play, because it's not just about racism out in the larger community. It's about our own campuses where we have many wonderful people. And I know you want to make a difference. I challenge you to bring the rigor of thinking to these issues as we think through. I challenge you to look at best practices. And so from the advanced program to this MILE program that we have built, to the work that NIH is doing with its BUILD program is another one that has many other elements of our MILE program in there. You know what is particularly significant to me is that we are talking about an area, the geosciences, that has such an important role to play in our future. And yet, so many people on the planet, so many people in our country have no idea about possible careers, what it will take. And so the idea of communications and the idea of having many more ambassadors who can bring people into the work in the same way that we have a Center for Women in IT. You know there's been a major decline in women in computer science. And so we have a scholars program that supports women and some men who become ambassadors in high schools and with college students in talking about the opportunities for women of all races in computing fields, given the heavy emphasis there. We need these branded programs in the geosciences for people of color, for women, that can use examples to make a difference. I want you to think about the notion at this point in our history as a country, but as countries around the world, as I look at what's happening across the globe. We are a divided society, I said before, broadly in humankind. Those who truly believe in the importance of the planet and the climate and using the science, those who don't think, then those who don't think it's as important. And when you look at those who don't think it's that important, think about the fact they've not had connections to the science. And that even sometimes when students do well in other courses, if they don't do well in the sciences, then they tend to think that's not for me on any level. And so I want you to be challenged and look in the mirror. You were fortunate. You did well. We did well in math and science and in these areas, and we're fascinated by it. I get goosebumps doing math all the time. I get goosebumps seeing my students who are excited about problem solving. But most people are not like that. We have to find ways of pulling them into the work. You know, this is a time when moral leadership is needed by all of us. You're all leaders. You are among the most prestigious citizens of the world at this time. And each of us must be a moral leader. There's an interesting definition put out by the World Economic Forum about moral leadership. And the essence is that moral leaders reaffirm in many ways the values that are most important. Your leaders have said an inclusive scientific workforce, an inclusive scientific enterprise, community will be important. You've talked about funding as a critical priority. Students undergrad, not just grad, need scholarships. If it were not for scholarships coming from private sources, coming from national agencies, we could not have been producing all of these blacks who go on to get PhDs in science. Students cannot work 20 hours on the outside waiting tables and study physics and Excel. And so the idea of pushing for scholarships for students in the geosciences, the idea of pushing for funding so that grad students can have the first 2 years just to work on the work and not have to be a teaching assistant. That will come with time. Let's get the academic foundation and the research going first. The idea of supporting young postdocs and faculty and making sure they get the grants they need to make sure they do succeed. And then the idea of listening to their voices when they're the only one in the department. Because every department should be thinking about more than one, because it's really challenging for that one. And we need to understand that perspective and see what it is we can do about that to broaden that participation. I want you to be inspired today, because that's what moral leaders do. They inspire people to work for the public good, to be elevated beyond the divisions, to think about what is in the best interest of future generations. When we think about the environment, it must be that we bring more people into this work, that we help the general public understand more through language that will not intimidate them, why it's important that we all are concerned. But it's also important for them to see some people looking like themselves. You know, my wife and I just recently agreed to be in the phase 3 trial of the moderna trial for the vaccine for COVID-19. Because they were having a hard time finding blacks who were willing, and some other people of color, but particularly blacks, who were willing to trust the scientists and the science to be in the trial. And when some friends asked why are blacks having such a hard time, I immediately say, go read the Tuskegee study. Go read about Henrietta Lacks and see ways in which people who may have meant well used black people miserably, use them in a way that is still remembered by those communities. And so building trust when you've got people at the highest of levels in our society sometimes not respecting evidence and science. Building trust will be our major challenge in the coming years. I was able to say to my friends when they questioned my wife's and mine being a part of this trial, I believe in the scientists who did the work. And they looked at me and said, this is a student of yours? And I said, yes. She actually was recruited from rural North Carolina and came to UMBC when she was 17, and then went and did a postback at NIH, and then went to Chapel Hill, got her PhD, came back, did a postdoc at NIH, and her name is Dr. Corbett, C-O-R-B-E-T-T. And Kizzmekia Corbett. She, as far as we can see, she is the first black woman to have a patent on a vaccine. She led the NIH team for the Moderna trial. Now that gives me goosebumps, and it should give you goosebumps. Because when you talk about the frontier, this idea of having people of color becoming excellent and well known, when I talk about my colleagues from my campus, when I talk about our students, the young investigator, the top young investigator in neuroscience last year in 2019 from the Neuroscience Society is another black graduate of our campus who's now associate professor endowed chair at Duke, Khafre Zarasa, D-Z-I-R-A-S-A, who's invented a pacemaker for the brain to address some mental disorders like depression and schizophrenia. When you think of scientists who've come up with a pacemaker for the brain, or who have a vaccine, a patent on a vaccine, you and I have not ever thought about people of color. We usually think about a brilliant white male and a few women. But I want you to think about what this one woman and this one young man will do to change the attitudes and the vision that children and people can have about what people of all backgrounds can do when they excel in science, what they can do for people of all races. And that is why you're here today, to say we can be better than this. and that as we reverse and eliminate structural racism, we will be much stronger as disciplines in the geosciences. I leave you with the words of Aristotle, who said, excellence is never an accident. It is the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. It represents the wisest option among many choices. And then he said something that gives me goosebumps, just like math. He said, choice, not chance, determines destiny. Choice, not chance, determines destiny. And there is the question. What do we choose? Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, or it gave me goosebumps. Usually it's new data. You get goosebumps from math. I get goosebumps from new data, and from and collecting data that just has given me goosebumps. The things that make me truly happy and excited. And I think your words have truly sort of set a challenge out for the geosciences, who you've noticed we have struggled. And I was wondering if maybe you could reflect on, because it's what I was thinking as listening to this morning, what is the role of a professional society to help? Should we be thinking of ways to provide that ambassador service back to those undergraduates? What, you've come at this very much from the role of professional society can be to help.
So let me say, Robin, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Do you hear me?
I
Great,
can.
because your voice was going in and out. So I got a part of the question enough that I can answer, and you can let me know if I'm not complete about what a professional society can do. There's several things I would say. Number one, I was delighted to hear from so many colleagues who are attached to, affiliated with the societies, and what they all were saying was we need to do more. And there are several things that come to my mind. Number one, we're all members of university communities, and we are in departments for the most part. And much of what needs to happen will happen at that departmental level. Now, I will say that it helps when universities have administrations that believe also in the importance. I do think we need to be building community among people of color with others who can focus on bringing more people into the work. And so your organization is considered the largest and one of the most prestigious in the world. Having a kind of approval of a set of actions focused on identifying campuses who are willing to work with national agencies in building these programs that will use that model that I talked about, that Meyerhoff model, in the way that Penn State and Chapel Hill are using it. But you see, most of the time when I see the model, it's being used more heavily in the life sciences. You see, I've not seen models where there is the emphasis on the geosciences broadly, although the life sciences can be a part of that. I understand that. But I am suggesting that there's a need for more visibility. And the two things, helping to attract funds to support faculty and students in this work as we think about broadening participation. And quite frankly, also having incentives for institutions to be involved in that work. I often say, starting with a few campuses that make a commitment and who are a part of grants to places that have the big money, the national agencies, quite frankly, to look at what works on a large scale. This is what we're hoping to do as we have been really pumping the numbers into life sciences and MD PhDs. But when you think about all the areas in your disciplines, connected with your disciplines, the first challenge is that most people who are not in your group don't really know what those disciplines are. I mean, when we think about to what extent do faculty in computer science talk about ways that computing will connect with another area and allow somebody to get into the area. So having opportunities for initiatives that focus on broadening understanding of how you get into the field, what's happening once you get into the field, and most important, identifying students who have the ability to succeed in the lower level courses that will give you a foundation that they can build on. You know, you'd be surprised right now, for example, there is a shortage of people of color in medicine. And we're having to look at ways of identifying students who are making it in those fundamental sciences, whether it's math or physics or chemistry, to say, okay, how do we get more of them to go into that area? We're doing the same thing with the Sloan Foundation in economics. But I would say we need that same kind of initiative with the prestige of AGU connected to some universities who will make the commitment to look at the multi-level approach of working with faculty and with students, undergrad and grad, and in this broad area of building academic strength coupled with communication about the brand. The brand. What do we mean by the geosciences in America and in the world, quite frankly, and what difference can we make?
Right. And I think that's what we are, you know, we have with NSF support, both programs to foster DEI ambassadors and leaders back to our community. And we're beginning to work on bridge programs through AGU. But I was struck by your concept of needing ambassadors that go beyond the individual geoscience departments to explain the importance of our science. I just thought I'd ask you a couple questions.
Go ahead.
Okay, our little delay here. I was just wondering if, before we open it up or start to take some of the questions from the audience, I was wondering if, you know, you'd reflect on, could you imagine that when you were 12 years old and you got arrested, how different things would be now and how same things would be now, and that my partners in the advanced program at Columbia were probably with you when you got arrested. So some of you have been fighting these battles for so long. So what advice do you have for this coming up generation who are stepping forward and entering this time of fostering change?
I appreciate that. You know, being in jail with the children and marching with Dr. King gave me the chance to think about the possibilities in an environment of fear, because we didn't know whether we would be okay. And what I will say is, I think about one of the big challenges is I didn't know about scientists. I had been in an NSF. That next year I was in an NSF program in math, but I only knew of one Black scientist, and that was George Washington Carver. And the question one has to ask is, who are the scientists? When I think about my two colleagues on my campus, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Desmos, when I think about Belay and Anthony, I'm thinking, how do we help them to be seen by more people, to know what the possibilities are, number one, but also I'm thinking about how do we help more departments, even the faculty, to know in other departments how connections can be made for students to think about interdisciplinarity and the important work that can be done if we can help students succeed in foundational level work, whether it's the physics, the computing, the math, and how we can move to other areas. What I'm suggesting is that there is this need for more of a commitment for our university working with different departments to help students know what those possibilities are. And we don't realize how small, how limited people are because they don't even know what the possibilities are. The Surgeon General is another Maho scholar, a young Black man who came to us from rural Maryland, and at 17, he had never seen a Black physician. He had never seen a Black physician. I would tell you, most kids Many kids in this country of all races have never seen a scientist themselves to talk to them of any kind. And then you get to the geosciences, you get my point. So exposure is important, you know, and then strength. I mean, the part that I don't want to miss though is having students with the kind of rigorous preparation that they can make it in the first 2 years of science. If they can do well in the first year or two, then they can build on that foundation. It's very important.
Right. I think that sense of rigor is so important. And because we know if you're going to get goosebumps about math or geophysics, you need to have the background and have not spent all the, and having had the support from your institution. Yeah. I think maybe we'll take some questions from the audience now. Right? Who said at UMBC that propelled her to second place in the science fair and made her fully turn to science,
I am so sorry, Robin. I'm not hearing you. I cannot hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you when you said that. That was the first thing I'd heard. Did you ask a question?
I can bring in scientists that don't look like them, and so that everyone can step forward and take part in this, that it's
I heard enough. I heard enough of the question from you that I know you're talking about all types of scientists, all backgrounds, pulling people into the work. No, I think it's very important. I never saw an African American in grad school on the professoriate, and most of the faculty at UMBC are not minorities. We've got the two I mentioned in geosciences, but generally the people besides them, the people who have been supporting Malhoff's have been white men and women, white and Asian men and women, who just believe in helping humankind and show authenticity. I think the most important quality for any student to see is that somebody is excited about the science. I saw in the chat room somebody saying just being excited about geosciences and saying, letting people know what they do. But the second is to show that you care and you want to pull people into the work. It's the notion of curiosity, of encouraging the curiosity, it seems to me, is very, very important.
Me now?
Yes, I heard that. Keep talking.
Okay. I will keep on going. Yeah. So, if you have to, how do we best, this question is, how do we encourage scientists to support environmental justice work and work in communities? I'm not sure if you can see the questions. I'm looking at question number 9, if that helps.
And I'm looking at, and I'm realizing that I probably need to change my glasses so I can see more clearly, but that's okay. I heard your question. I did hear you. How do we encourage more people to get involved in environmental justice? We need to see the examples. We need to see best practices and to talk to people who are involved in that work in different ways. We've had people with all of the funding we've had from NASA, particularly in different centers, working on issues involving the environment for a long time, and on issues involving people in inner cities, for example, and in environments where you've got issues involving asthma connected to zip codes. And so people simply have not connected the environmental work with social justice. They need to see specific examples in the same way that when we talk about STEM, and what that means, or when people want to put in the word STEAM and put in art, most people have no idea how art can be connected to science. And so when they see examples, similarly, when they see examples, and I would say one of the things a society can do is to, and you may already have this, would be to have some wonderful document all through the technology videos that focus on great examples of environmental justice being done by geoscientists that people can use as they think about what they can do, but also so students can have their eyes open. We know that students of color and women are especially interested in social justice. They need to appreciate how that interest can be connected to the work. I know that our people in some of the environmental areas on my campus are very involved in environmental justice on the policy side, but on the science side. And as we deal with issues involving everything from water, I mean, no example to me is more visible and more stunningly tragic than what we've seen in Michigan with water and with communities, quite frankly, and what we've not done and what people have not understood about the importance of science in understanding and attacking those kinds of problems.
Justice, is that being included in criteria? Justice, you can't hear me.
I'm so sorry. One other point about environmental justice, though, that you will appreciate is that we also have an Institute for Marine and Environmental Technology involving the University of Maryland Environmental Science Center and involving our medical school. And I know that they, in their work on issues involving for everything from the Chesapeake Bay to so many grants, have focused on areas that will bring in this issue of environmental justice. And that is downtown Baltimore.
Okay, I'm going to try moving closer to my mic to see if that works.
Great. Oh, this is fine. This is fine.
Oh, okay. Then, as long as you don't mind seeing my monster head. So from Eric Davidson would like to ask, what can R1 institutions do to help newly appointed assistant professors to feel welcome and have the resources they need to succeed?
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to say something about that, but I want to say something about your institution and you and Peter. I know that you have for years been bringing students of color in, even at the undergrad level, to give them exposure from the Institute for Marine and Environmental Technology, to let them study and do research as undergrad, and then recruiting grad students to it. But going to the faculty, I think it's important to listen to our young faculty, minorities, women, people in general, young faculty, to create an environment that encourages them to speak their truth, to believe that they can say what they're really perceiving and experiencing in the environment. That might help you to be even more supportive when they know that it's the same thing we've done with the advanced program. And then I would also say it helps when you can connect them to other people of color who may not even be in the discipline. People need to see, even if they're not allowed around within our university system of Maryland, quite frankly, it helps for them to know other people. But most important, I think, just showing your authenticity, and I know you guys are doing that there, is really important. People appreciate knowing that others care about them and about their future.
Excellent. Allison James was one of the first people to step forward to the question, and it's one I think many people struggle with, is how to foster anti-racism in a small department without sounding preachy or being dismissed.
Right. It's such an
important... What are your thoughts on that one?
Sure. It's such an important question. And you need allies. You need allies. And sometimes when it's a small department and you've been saying some things over and over, whether about gender or race, and you're not feeling that you're making much progress, you need allies who can be supportive of what you're saying. And sometimes bringing in a speaker who is respected in your discipline or in a broad area, who can talk about these things, can be very helpful. But also, I would say identifying people across several departments so that you're not the only one saying these things. And, my mother was an English teacher, a math and English teacher, and she would often quote Emily Dickinson, who said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And her point was sometimes when you hit people with the hard truth, they'll come out fighting or they just close down. So sometimes when we all are having to find ways of using different approaches to get people to plant seeds to make some progress. And sometimes it's not as easy to make a lot of progress at first, but planting seeds, using allies, and thinking about approach, and sometimes just talking to one person rather than in the departmental meeting, just to try to get one person to appreciate more of what you're saying, to get another ally. So you're not always the one. It shouldn't always be the woman talking about the women's issues or the black about the black issues. We need people from broad backgrounds saying, no, these are things that are important to all of us. These are American issues, gender, race, and then they're humankind issues. And your disciplines more than any others would appreciate the idea of humankind and the globe, that these are issues we need to face and think about for the entire world.
Move forward is looking at things as the system, the ecosystem. Okay, closer. I will get even closer. So much of what the reaction this year has been, many geoscientists have tried to develop programs with HBCUs, but they've been hard to sustain. How do you suggest our community work on building this capacity with these colleges and maintain them over time?
I think it's important to identify campuses with whom you can have strong support. As a proud graduate of Hampton, at a time when 80% of blacks were in HBCUs before I went to Illinois, I am certainly supportive of HBCUs. We work with Howard. We've gotten students from A&T, for example, North Carolina A&T. But at the same time, let me say that 75% or more of black students are not in HBCUs. You need to identify, it's fine to work with HBCUs. They are important. But we should also be identifying other institutions who have minority students, black students, Hispanic students, who can become connected with you. You want to find institutions that will have a pool of students who are very interested in science. We're very privileged at UMBC. Half of our students across races are in science and engineering. So there's a big pool of people there. If you look at my articles in Issues in Science and Technology over the last few years, you'll get a list of the top 50 institutions of blacks and of Hispanics who have been producing bachelors who go on to get PhDs. Look at that list. That will tell you where you have the greatest potential for identifying students and faculty with whom you can collaborate. Come closer. Yes. For some reason, Robin, we can't hear you. Let me suggest this, since we only have a couple of minutes. Robin, if I can say, can you hear me? Can you hear me? One of the points that we can take from the fact that we're having communications problem with the hearing is about the fact that we are learning to be more adaptable in unpredictable situations. And this is one of those times. And so I would say that being able to use our phones to some extent when these things happen, but also, quite frankly, being able to keep going to make a point. And the one point I would leave you with, if we can't hear Robin, that I want everybody to think about is that every person can make a difference. Every person, you can get involved to identify a person of color with whom you can give, support. And it's that, and building community among people and speaking the truth about these issues that would be most important.
Okay, because you prompted me, I'll use my phone. I want to thank you so much for this opportunity and this discussion today. And I know I've learned a lot, and you've inspired me to continue to think about how to look at both what we can do as individuals, what we can do as institutions, and what we can do to address the culture, because we know we need to have everyone at the table while we do rigorous science, and that we need to bring the science of diversity to the table as we address the systemic racism in our science. So thank you so much for inspiring us, everything from Maya D'Angelo to your mom to goosebumps over math.
goosebumps
And
over Matt.
we look
And
forward to
we look
hearing more
forward
about
to
connections
hearing more about connection.
and diversifying our science, because we need everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.